Yeah.
Good afternoon and welcome, and thanks for joining us today for our new knowledge session. If this is your first time, where have you been? We've been doing this now going on 11 years. This is a professional development program that originally started as a way to support the Washington County Business Challenge that's held annually to help our new and existing businesses access training programs to help build skills, and it's kept continued to growing, and now we've probably done over 250 over the past 10 plus years. My name is Sandy Ratliff. I am with Virginia Community Capital. If you're not familiar with us, we are a community development financial institution in Virginia that's focused on both lending, investing, and community innovation services. Part of that community innovations is providing workshops like today to help our businesses launch and grow in Southwest Virginia. This is a collaboration with the Virginia Highlands Small Business Incubator, the Washington County Chamber of Commerce, and the Town of Abington Economic Development. And as I say, it's a way to build skills in business. Today's session is being recorded for education and training purposes. And we do have everyone muted as a way to stay on track. But if you do have questions for our presenter today, please post those in the Q&A section, and we will address those at the end of his presentation. I personally am looking forward to today's session because I have lived and been in these mountains all of my life, and I'm anxious to learn what's available that I might have thought was a weed, but it's actually something that you could potentially make money from or use for health reasons for yourself. And I'm excited to have Robin Suggs with, he's the Procurement Manager with Appalachian Sustainable Development to present today's session. Robin is going to provide an overview of some of the top 10 most commonly produced forest crops in Central and South or Southern Appalachia and their uses. Robin, I've heard from leadership at Appalachian Sustainable Development of some of the opportunities that I mentioned before we started, that I've even heard that there is a certain herb that the makeup industry comes from all over the world to get because it's only here in Southwest Virginia. So I'm anxious to learn what's available, and I'm going to turn it over to you. And again, just remember, if you have questions for Robin, please post those in the Q&A section and we'll get to it. Robin, it's all yours.
Great. Well, thank you, Sandy, for that introduction. And I'm excited to be here for new knowledge. Again, my name is Robin Suggs, and I'm Procurement Manager for the Appalachian Sustainable Development Appalachian Harvest Herb Hub, which is in Duffield, Virginia, over in Scott County. And just a little background about ASD. Appalachian Sustainable Development was founded in 1995. We're a nonprofit, 501c3 nonprofit. We work in sustainable rural and community and economic development in the Central Appalachians. Our service area basically runs from, the Pennsylvania border to the north. We cover West Virginia, Eastern Kentucky, western parts of Virginia, East Tennessee, Western North Carolina. I don't think I've left anyone out in that geography, but basically what the ARC calls their Central Appalachian region, Appalachian Regional Commission, Central Appalachian region. The Herb Hub, which is, I mentioned, located in Duffield, Virginia, is located within a previously existing or currently existing food hub, which is a large produce handling facility. We buy produce from farmers and other folks throughout the region and distribute it to retailers, again, throughout the region. So we help small farmers market their produce that way. Things like, bell peppers, cabbage, broccoli, pumpkins, pretty much you name it. If you see it in the produce section of the grocery store, we handle it. So the vision for the Herb Hub basically developed around 2017. We had some folks that were interested in growing both field and forest botanicals, or that even have been growing field and forest botanicals that while they had land and they had some expertise, they really didn't have access to a lot of the markets that ASD's developed through the years. And they didn't have the processing capability on site. They didn't have wash stations and dryers and ways to pack the material and get it shipped where it's in good shape. So, we had this food hub facility here in Duffield that's a GAP and USDA certified facility that now we have an herb hub located in, which is a shared use facility. We have wash stations, we have dryers, we have both commercial Excalibur dryers, which are stainless steel units that are programmable, and then we have walk-in dryers, we have coolers, and we're in the process of setting up some milling capacity, so we'll be able to cut and sift herbs for folks that want to make teas and that sort of thing. So we've come a long way. We still have a lot of things we want to do, but I'm sort of setting the stage here for my involvement and why I'm here talking today about forest botanicals. That's certainly a time-honored tradition in terms of things that have been harvested, for economic value and for personal use, as Sandy mentioned, in our region for many, many years, hundreds of years. It's my understanding that Daniel Boone was one of the early harvesters of American ginseng in our region, and there's a lot of folklore that goes along with those stories. I won't get into all that today, but I will talk a little bit about American ginseng. Just a little bit about my background. Before I came on board with Appalachian Sustainable Development, I owned an herb company in Western North Carolina down in the Smokies for about 15, 16 years, I guess. Basically, I sold raw botanicals to medicine makers around the country. If you've ever gone into something like a Whole Foods and gone to their health and body care section, or gone into your favorite health food store, you'll probably see things on the shelves in the form of tinctures and capsules and salves. A lot of the raw ingredients, like Sandy mentioned, a lot of the raw ingredients for those products come from this region and have historically come from this region. So what we're trying to do is to basically economically ramp up the region's production of these native plants that have been utilized and harvested for a long, long time. We're trying to increase the quality of the material that is coming from our region, and we're also trying to put more money in the pockets of the people producing these crops by opening up new markets and expanded markets and getting folks premium for their production. The way the Herb Hub works is basically as a sales agent, in addition to providing a shared use processing facility, we help farmers market their products, both field and forest botanicals, and we take a commission. So in order for us to make more money, the producer has to make more money. So we really feel like, we go to work for the producer on behalf of the buyer to make sure that the producer's quality is there and that we're meeting the quality expectations of the buyers. And we work for the producer on behalf of the buyer, or the buyer on behalf of the producer, to make sure that we're getting the most money for these high quality products as we possibly can. So we're a little unique in that we don't do traditional buy sell. At least we don't at the present time. We could incorporate that into our vision down the road, but just wanted to set a little stage of why we're talking about forest botanicals and why they're important to the region. And I'm going to go through a little presentation here of, like Sandy mentioned, 10 of the most commonly produced forest botanicals in the region. And these are ones that you may or may not have if you're a landowner in your forest. But many folks do, some of which you'll more than likely recognize if you spend any time outside or are a student of the natural world. Other ones you may not, may be new to you. So I'm going to get into this, this list today. And the first species we're going to talk about is black cohosh. Black cohosh occurs in rich mesic forest. Throughout this range that you see on this range map was provided by the USDA Plants Database website. You'll notice that the range extends from some of the eastern provinces of Canada almost to the Gulf Coast. It doesn't occur within every county and every part of the province listed. This plant is mostly restricted to the upland areas in these states. So in the Southeast and Mid-Atlantic and Ohio and Tennessee Valley, we're typically talking about the Appalachian Highlands, Cumberland Plateau, Blue Ridge Mountains, Shenandoah Valley area, those types of environs. And what you'll notice as we go through this slideshow is most of the species that we're talking about occur roughly in this geographic range. Some extend a little farther west, some extend a little farther north, some extend a little farther south, but basically we're talking about species that occur within the eastern third or maybe eastern half of the country, but almost without fail, they're within the region, shaded regions, and restricted to the more upland areas, a lot of times cooler slopes and that sort of thing. So just keep that in mind as we go through these slides. Black cohosh does prefer deep soils that are high in organic matter, and it's a high demand crop in herbal markets, especially in the European Union. If you go into even stores like probably Walmart and again Whole Foods, maybe even Food City in the pharmacy area, you may find a product called Remifemin, which typically is used to treat menopausal symptoms in females. This product is a highly standardized herbal extract that is manufactured in Europe, and the active ingredient in that product comes from black cohosh. So that may be one, maybe a trade name that some of y'all recognize, maybe not, but black cohosh is in a really wide range of herbal products from tinctures to standardized extracts. You might even find some in teas. I'm not really going to get into any medicinal uses today. Number one, I tell people I'm a plant doctor, not a people doctor. I've been working with plants for a long time, but I am not a certified herbalist by any stretch of the imagination. But knowing the traditional uses and current commercial uses of plants are really important when you're planning your production, because you want to know what's in demand and maybe what's not. A lot of folks describe this industry as very shallow and volatile. What's really popular one year may not be popular the next. But one thing about black cohosh is we see perennial interest and growing interest in the marketplace for black cohosh. If you've never seen black cohosh in the wild, it looks like this. The botanical name for black cohosh is Actea racemosa. It's actually blooming this time of year throughout most of our range. There's quite a few plants in the woods that look like black cohosh in terms of the leaf structure. These compound leaves are shared with a number of lookalike species. But the easiest way to tell that you have black cohosh is this time of year. It puts up these really tall white spires of flowers in the woodlands. So a lot of times if you've got these growing in your woodlands, you're looking across a sea of tall white flowers. It's one that's easily cultivated by divisions. It is primarily grown for its rhizome or root. I'll take the opportunity now to elaborate on that a little bit. Most of the plants within our region, I would say at least the native forest botanicals, primarily you're talking about plants that are grown for the below ground portions of the plant, the roots and rhizomes. And we refer to those as roots and rhizomes. Herbs, the term herb specifically is generally used for the above ground portion of the plant. We don't see a lot of use for black cohosh with the herb or the above ground portion of the plant. And then we also have a category of botanical products that come out of the forest here that are tree barks, and we'll talk about those in a little while. But black cohosh, again, is harvested and used primarily for its root. It prefers dappled shade, but will also grow in some sun on rich, moist sites, especially when you get into the higher altitudes, the cooler areas. The rhizomes are usually harvested in the fall when the tops die down. And I would say probably most of the demand, or at least much of the demand internationally, is met through the wild harvesting of this plant. So I bring that up because there's a couple of ways that these native perennials are produced. Traditionally in our region, a lot of the folks that have been involved economically with the production of these plants have harvested from the wild. We're seeing more and more folks get into what we call forest farming, which is the intentional production and cultivation of these plants in their shaded woodlands. Typically, the woodlands we're talking about are comprised of mixed hardwood species. Typically, not all these species we'll talk about today, and I'll make some differentiation as we go through here, but a lot of these species are what we would call rich coast species. They typically occur on cooler sites, your northern and eastern exposures. A lot of times we look for tree overstories like tulip poplar, basswood, red oak, sugar maple, not so much your ridgetop species like white oak and sourwood and sassafras and scarlet oak, maybe southern red oak. We generally, like I say, find these in richer sites. So if you are interested in forest farming, that's something that we help folks get into. One of the things what we encourage you to do is take a look at your woodlands and see what's growing there now. And if you have an appropriate mix of canopy tree species, that's a good sign. But there's no sign like actually having some wild black cohosh growing on your site already. So if you have black cohosh occurring on your site, chances are you probably have an ideal woodland for the production of that species. So the next plant we're going to talk about is golden seal. Some parts of its range, it's known as yellowroot, not to be confused with Xanthorrhiza simplissima, which is a shrub that grows from probably Southwest Virginia on south to nearly the Gulf Coast. That's one reason we use botanical names. Like you'll notice back with black cohosh, the common name is black cohosh. The genus and species is Actaea racemosa. That plant, black cohosh, is also known as rattleweed in its range. But regardless of where you are, if you use the term Actaea racemosa, folks will know you're talking about black cohosh. Same thing with golden seal. So as we don't confuse it with yellowroot, we want to use the correct botanical names, and we'll get to the botanical name in golden seal in just a minute. But again, you'll see that in the range map, that golden seal occurs in roughly the same broad geographical area that black cohosh does. There's a little bit of differentiation here. But typically, golden seal is going to be more widely distributed in the Ohio and Tennessee Valley, Cumberland Plateau, parts of West Virginia, Western Pennsylvania. It does show that it occurs in places like North Carolina, Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, but in those states, it's very restricted to certain locales within those areas. And one reason we believe golden seal prefers places a little west of the main spine of the Blue Ridge and Appalachians is it prefers circumneutral soils, which are soils that are a little closer to neutral in pH. And typically that indicates the presence of limestone as a substrate. So once we get over in the Cumberland Plateau and a lot of the Ohio and Tennessee Valley, we do have soils that are composed of limestone or decomposed limestone. It's a very high demand herb, or maybe I should, well, we use both the root or the rhizome and the herb, and I'll get to that in a minute, but it's a very high demand product for herbal markets, and it's valued primarily as a bitter and antimicrobial. And what that means is bitters are typically used to stimulate the digestive system, and of course antimicrobials are just that, it's used to fight overgrowth of bacteria and that sort of thing. Golden seal, the botanical name is Hydrastis canadensis. So if you have someone saying, well, do you have any yellowroot growing on your property? You may want to say, well, are you talking about Hydrastis canadensis or Xanthorrhiza simplissima? I'm not trying to dazzle anyone with botanical names here, but it is important that if you're growing for market or you are wild harvesting products for market, that you know exactly what you're harvesting, because the uses and chemical properties of plants vary widely from species to species. I will say that Southern yellowroot or xanthorrhiza does share some chemical constituents with golden seal, but that's about where the similarity ends. They're not related at all. So I prefer the common name golden seal. Most folks that you know that know the plant call it golden seal, but everyone that knows their botanical nomenclature would know it by Hydrastis canadensis. So it's another one that's easily cultivated from divisions where it's native. It requires some shade, typically a little more than black cohosh. The rhizomes, again, are usually harvested in the fall when the tops die down, and much of the demand is currently met through wild harvesting. It's one that's easy to grow. Like I say, traditionally, the demand has been met from wild harvesting, but there's no reason that we can't encourage more forest farm production of golden seal in our region. I mentioned that most of the demand for golden seal, most of the golden seal in the market is for the root of the plant or the rhizome of the plant. There is a small demand for golden seal leaf, so we would call that the herb, but it's nowhere near the market demand for that there is for the rhizome. And of course, in terms of actual pounds of production, it's a lot easier to get a couple of pounds of dried rhizome than it is a couple of pounds of dried leaf. Typically, fresh roots dry down at a ratio of 3 to 4 to 1. A lot of times the tops dry down a ratio of 10 or more to 1. There's more moisture in the leaves, so it takes an awful lot of fresh golden seal leaves to make a dried pound. Not nearly as many rhizomes. So the next species we're going to talk about is one most folks in the region have heard of. Maybe some folks have even been involved in the harvesting of this plant or the management of this plant on their property. It's American ginseng. Again, you'll see that we have a range that is similar to the previous species we talked about, roughly the eastern half of the continent. Again, it's going to occur in upland areas within those shaded ranges. The nice thing about the USDA plants database website where this map was pulled from is it actually allows you to zoom in on this map and get county scale data. So you can see what counties within these states that these plants occur within. I will say that not all counties that ginseng occurs in or any of these plants occur in are represented on this map. What that county level data represents are counties where actual herbarium specimens have been collected from. So you'll see some gaps in the county distribution that can be explained by that. A lot of folks will say, well, you know, my county is not represented. I know American ginseng grows there. Simply means that, you know, an herbarium specimen has not been collected from that county. So as with some of our other species, it occurs in rich mesic soils or rich mesic hardwood forest. And the term mesic just basically means well-drained. Doesn't occur in wet areas. But it will occur on some drier sites at times, especially on northern and eastern exposures. It typically prefers deep soils that are high in organic matter. Again, typically those woodland exposures that are north or east facing are a little higher in organic matter than those that are south and west facing. On cooler exposures, the organic matter tends to build up over time. On your warmer sites, like your west and south facing exposures, the organic matter burns up, it decomposes because those are hotter sites. It decomposes more quickly and it doesn't tend to build up. Those sites also tend to dry out a little more quickly. It's a high demand herb. Traditionally has been exported. Most of our wild American ginseng goes to Asian markets, probably, I'm sure well in excess of 95, maybe closer to 99%. It can be a very expensive botanical. Most botanicals that we're talking about sell in the wholesale market for anywhere from $35 to maybe $130 a dried pound. Ginseng is one that sometimes sells for over $1,000 a dried pound, sometimes $1,200 a dry pound. And that would specifically be for wild ginseng and sometimes what we call wild simulated ginseng. American ginseng is sort of its own its own animal, if you will, in terms of how it's marketed and where it's marketed and what it's valued for. A lot of the botanicals that we're talking about today are marketed and valued because of the chemical constituency and some of the bioactivity that they provide in humans. American ginseng is a little different. The Asian market values American ginseng because it is it's a species that has been used for thousands of years in the East. It is valued for not only its chemical constituency, but also its energetic properties, which are a little hard to quantify in Western science. But that doesn't mean they're not real, doesn't mean they're not driving the market. So we have to respect the customer in this case. There are a couple of different production protocols that we would use to produce American ginseng. I mentioned wild, which is simply going around the forest and collecting wild ginseng roots. Wild ginseng has become increasingly more difficult to find because of development and over harvesting through the years. So a lot of folks have taken to producing wild simulated ginseng, where they simply go through their woods and they scatter or plant seeds annually in the fall, and they enhance, embellish, and otherwise establish populations in the woods where maybe ginseng wasn't found before, or maybe the populations were sparse and scattered. Then there is forest farm ginseng or woods grown ginseng. In terms of the marketplace in Asia, woods grown ginseng, and there's also just spread of cultivated ginseng. It's not a it's a product not grown in the woods. It's typically grown under artificial shade. But in terms of the 4 production practices that I just mentioned, I think I mentioned 4. Let's see: wild simulated, woods grown, and cultivated. The price range varies drastically, like I say, from maybe $1,000, $1,100, $1,200 a pound for wild dry ginseng to maybe $20, $30 a pound for cultivated ginseng. So I won't get into all the reasons for that, and won't get into a lot of production protocols today. But I will say that American ginseng, which is also botanically known as Panax quinquefolius, can be cultivated or produced primarily from seed. As I mentioned, it does require some shade. Traditionally and legally, I might add, at least on public or property that you don't own, it's usually harvested in the fall. And I mention that because the trade of ginseng is internationally regulated by CITES, which is Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species, which is a collaboration of various multinational agencies around the world. The same Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species that regulates things like ivory and rhinoceros horn and some of these more esoteric animal and plant products around the world. The Virginia Department of Agriculture and Consumer Services is the state agency that sets the rules and the seasons for ginseng harvest and the regulations pertaining to such. I think I mentioned most of the wild demand is currently met through wild harvesting. There traditionally has been a large amount of cultivated ginseng coming out of the states of Wisconsin and mostly southeastern Canada. Like I say, most of the demand is for ginseng roots, although there is a growing demand for ginseng leaves or the herb of the ginseng plant for things like teas and that sort of thing. So the next plant I'm going to talk about is bloodroot. That's a plant that y'all may or may not be familiar with. Again, you'll see that the range is roughly the eastern half of North America. It occurs in rich mesic hardwood forest, prefers deep soils that are high in organic matter. Gives it sound familiar. It's another one of those rich cove species. I say it's a low to moderate demand as an herbal ingredient right now. Primarily, it's been used as antimicrobial and grown as an additive for animal feed as a growth promoter. In the European Union, there are products that were originally formulated with bloodroot. that were used to replace antibiotics in livestock production. And those antibiotics were basically used not to treat sick animals, but to make the animals bulk up, put on weight more quickly, shorten the production time, basically, is what we're talking about. So I mentioned that product was originally formulated with bloodroot, but because bloodroot was relatively expensive and difficult to source, that production has started to use an alternative species, but there are probably some uses for some other uses along with that use for the development of new products using bloodroot as a primary ingredient. Bloodroot is also known as Sanguinaria canadensis. You'll see that the plant is deeply lobed. It's one that comes up in the early spring. It has a really beautiful white flower. It also has some ornamental value. A lot of folks will put this in their woodland garden because it is quite attractive. I wish I had a better slide of this plant and flower. Maybe I'll add one here soon. And probably should take a moment to notice that my background is in ornamental horticulture. So a lot of times I know these plants not only for their medicinal value, but also for their ornamental value. They're great. A lot of them are great to use in the home landscape if you have a heavily wooded property and a suitable site. It's easily grown by division or seed. And when I'm mentioning divisions, basically we're talking about maybe digging the rhizomes during the dormant period, which roughly runs from the first frost in the fall till just before the last frost in the spring. Before things start to green up, folks will dig the rhizomes and break them into smaller sections and replant them so you can reproduce by divisions or seed. This is a very early blooming species. The plant has already flowered and gone to seed, and in some cases already started to die down. Bloodroot, like I mentioned, comes up very early in the spring and takes advantage of that really bright early spring sunlight in the forest that occurs during the short amount of time between the period where the weather warms up enough to commence plant growth until the time where the forest canopy closes in enough to create dense shade on the forest floor. So it sort of does its thing and completes its life cycle in that short window in the spring. And some plants are even more attuned to those conditions, and we call those spring ephemerals, things like trout lily and a few others. Ramps are one that come to mind that are definitely spring ephemerals. They're down already. But again, bloodroot requires some shade. Like a lot of these botanicals, the rhizomes are usually harvested in the fall and late summer after the tops die down. And most of the demand is currently met through wild harvesting. And there's not a lot of cultivation of this plant at the moment, but it's certainly a candidate to look at if you're considering forest farming. The next species we're going to talk about is Solomon seal. Its range expands a little further west than some of the species we speak of today. Again, it occurs in mesic hardwood forest. It prefers deep soils that are high in organic matter, and it's one that is rapidly growing in demand in the herbal trade. Typically, it's used for connective tissue issues and musculoskeletal issues. A lot of folks use it to reduce inflammation, that sort of thing. That's all I'll say about the medicinal use of the plant. But I will say that the recognition of this plant in the herbal trade and in the industry is growing, and there seems to be more and more demand by the year for this species. A lot of folks, if you have this plant in your woods, you'll recognize it by the compound leaves, or the alternate leaves that run up the stem, and the small white flowers that hang down directly from the stem. Sometimes you'll see this plant anywhere from maybe 10 and 12 inches tall up to head height, 5-6 feet tall. There's a lot of discussion over whether those morphological differences are due to genetics or environment, and the jury's still out, but the species can be quite variable across its range and across various sites. Solomon seal is known as Polygonatum biflorum to folks that are involved in identifying this plant taxonomically. It's easily grown from seed and by root divisions. It prefers some shade, but will tolerate some sun on cooler, moist sites. A lot of times you get its greatest growth in woodland edges, especially if those woodland edges have deep clay soils that stay sort of damp and they're fairly rich and, get plenty of moisture. The rhizomes of this one typically can be a little different in terms of the harvest time. Some customers prefer spring harvested material and some customers prefer fall harvested material, and probably all points in between. Again, as with most folks involved in the trade of anything, the customer is king in terms of businesses providing what they want. So if you're developing a product line or you're growing plants or botanicals for trade, you need to grow them with what your customer is looking for in mind. And can't say enough about that, but that's more general business knowledge there, or sales knowledge, I would imagine. Much of the demand, if not most, is currently met through wild harvesting. This is a plant that a lot of times customers want fresh material of. They're looking for the roots. I don't know of anyone that is buying the herb of this plant or the top of the plant right now. But I will say that a lot of customers are looking for fresh material as opposed to dried. It's one that's easy to grow and really should be incorporated into forest farming production schemes if folks are looking to produce forest botanicals on their property. Ramps are a little sort of the outlier on this list. They're not typically thought of as medicinal plants. They're more of a culinary plant. A lot of folks in the region may be familiar with ramps as an early spring green, wild leeks, they're also known as, but they occur in rich, moist hardwood forests, typically a little richer and moister than most of the species we've talked about. And also typically they're found at higher elevations, especially in the more southerly parts of their range. I know in Western North Carolina, typically you don't find them below about 3,000 feet. Same goes for East Tennessee. You get a little farther north up in West Virginia, Pennsylvania, and they started to show up at lower elevations. Once you get up into the Great Lakes states, they'll occur at lake level, which is generally 500-600 feet above sea level. I imagine 600 feet above sea level. So they typically do like cooler sites, moisture sites, and species we've talked about before. Again, it is a true spring ephemeral, comes up very early in the spring, dies down. Right now it's sending up its flower shoots. Kind of interesting is that, when it flowers, the leaves are not present. So a lot of folks don't really notice this plant when it's in flower, but right now, at least in the Southern Appalachians, they are sending up flower stalks. It is a very high demand crop for the culinary markets. It's often sold as a wild edible along with fiddleheads and morels and other wild crops. And typically it's more upscale restaurants, white tablecloth restaurants in metropolitan areas like New York. There's a tremendous demand for wild ramps in the culinary trade right now. Most of the wild ramp demand has been satisfied through wild harvest, but it's certainly a great candidate for cultivation in a woodland setting if you have the right conditions. It is an allium trichocum, which means it's in the onion family. I mentioned that a lot of folks refer to it as wild leeks. It's also definitely steeped in Southern and Central Appalachian heritage. There are a lot of ramp festivals in the spring in some small communities. A lot of volunteer fire departments and rescue squads use ramp sales and ramp and fried fish, fried trout dinners to raise money for their rescue squads. It is one that's pretty easily grown from seed. It requires a fair amount of shade. It does like sun early in the season. So again, during that brief window between the time the soil warms up enough to allow for growth until the time that the leaf canopy closes in, it actually benefits from some pretty bright light during that period. But for the most part, it grows in fairly dark, damp, cool sites. The leaves and bulbs are harvested in the early spring. when the leaves are present. We'll see from the picture on the left that there's green strap-like leaves. I will caution that it looks a lot like Clinton's lily. If you have any doubt of the ID on this plant, just dig one up, smell it. If it has a strong garlicky onion smell to it, you've got a ram. Okay. Much of the demand, again, is currently met through wild harvesting. There is some limited cultivation, but it's one we need to look at more in terms of being cultivated in our region, especially if you've got the right site. Wild yam is a species that we talk about quite a bit. It's one that also occurs on rich mesic hardwood sites. It also occurs at the edge of the forest. It prefers soils that are high in organic matter and are evenly moist. It is a fairly high demand crop in herbal markets. It's typically used as a phytoestrogen, which that's a broad category of plant compounds that are not true hormones, or not true estrogen, but have estrogenic or estrogen-like effects on human biology. Another plant y'all may be familiar with is soy, that also sometimes has phytoestrogenic effects on human biology. But wild yam is a native plant that's used in lots of preparations for those effects. Wild yam typically means Dioscorea villosa. There's also another species, Dioscorea quadernata, that occurs in the southeast and southern and central Appalachians. Those two are probably used interchangeably in the herb trade, but typically most companies are looking for Dioscorea villosa. There's some slight differences in the morphology of those plants. They're easily grown from seed and even more easily grown from rhizome divisions. They can be grown in sun or shade, but they need some moisture on the warmer sites. There needs some shade also on the drier sites. The rhizomes, again, are usually harvested in the fall, and most of the demand is currently met through wild harvesting, but again, it's a really easy one to grow. The next plant we talk about is a bit of a departure because we're talking about a small tree or a large shrub. Witch hazel occurs, again, roughly maybe eastern half of North America. Occurs in mesic hardwood forest, along in moist woods, bluffs, alluvial areas, mostly in uplands. You don't find it quite as much in the coastal plain. Prefers deep soils that are high in organic matter. And this is a plant that has been in demand for a long, long time in this country. We've got a well-established witch hazel industry. Interestingly enough, most of which is centered around the state of Connecticut. That's just where a lot of the traditional processing of witch hazel went on. If you go into most drugstores or pharmacy sections of grocery stores, you will see a lot of witch hazel products on the market. Typically, they're found next to the rubbing alcohol and hydrogen peroxide. Most of these are alcohol-based extracts. They're not all high quality. So I think there's probably some product development that could be undertaken with this species that I would say is generally an underutilized species in our region. It occurs quite widely throughout our area. Witch hazel is also known as Hamamelis virginiana. As you can see, the common name witch hazel more than likely originates from the fact that the leaves look a lot like hazel or hazelnut. But that's about where the similarity ends. Usually grown from seed. It can also be transplanted from the wild and coppiced or grown as a small tree. Coppicing is simply basically you are maintaining a tree or a shrub as a multi-stem specimen. You're cutting out the central trunk, and since this one does sucker quite freely from the roots, you can cut the top down and send up multiple shoots from the roots. And with this plant, we're looking for the bark and the leaves. Both the bark and the leaves have the compounds that are used in the medicinal trade. So when you're harvesting the bark, you're killing that stem. So that's why we talk about coppicing. But even if you take the main trunk out, it does send up more shoots, and will basically form a colony of a multi-trunk specimen. It does prefer some shade, though it tolerates some sun on moist sites. The bark is usually harvested in the spring after the leaves come on. So right now is a good time to harvest bark. And the reason being is because there's a lot of moisture in the cambium or the inner bark, so it strips easily from the wood. The leaves are usually harvested in the spring and summer after the tree is fully leafed out. Much of the demand currently is met through wild harvesting, although there is some managed production, mostly in the Northeast US, again, around the state of Connecticut. And it's a good overstory candidate for multi-story cropping systems, which means that basically, since it's a small tree, a lot of times you can work it into a forest farm as a lower canopy species. If you've got maybe sugar maple and tulip poplar forming the overstory canopy, you've got something like witch hazel forming your lower canopy, and then you've got other species that we talked about earlier, like bloodroot or American ginseng or golden seal, occupying the forest floor. So one cool thing about forest farming is you're not tending a field of one species. In a forest, you can grow different species in the same site based on vertical production rather than just horizontal production. So again, witch hazel is one we should look at in our region because it is so abundant, so easy to grow, and there's no value-added processing that I know of witch hazel going on in the area other than on the cottage scale. The next one we talk about is slippery elm. This is a tree species. Again, it's used for its bark. It occurs in mesic hardwood forest and sheltered woodland edges. Prefers deep soils that are high in organic matter. As long as they have adequate moisture, they grow quite well. You'll see the range, again, is roughly the eastern half of North America. It's a very high demand product, typically used as a demulcent or something that helps the flow of mucus if you have a cold, and especially if you have a dry cough, to make the cough more productive. A lot of folks use things like slippery elm. It soothes mucous membranes. It's the inner bark that we're after, the slippery elm. Ulmus rubra is the genus and species. Typically, they're grown from seed or offshoots from medium and offshoots and it becomes a medium to large tree. Usually in the forest, gets anywhere from 30 to 60 feet tall, grows a little more quickly in the sun or in abandoned fields. Will tolerate shade, but you get much better growth in the sun. One problem with slippery elm, it does succumb to Dutch elm disease. So a lot of times when the tree is about 20, 30 years old, it will start to die. So usually when you do your harvest before then, because once the tree is infected with Dutch elm disease, it renders the bark unmarketable. And again, it's the inner bark, usually harvested in the spring, just like witch hazel. And much of this demand is currently met through wild harvesting as well. Although there is some managed production of slippery elm, and again, Dutch elm disease is a problem throughout its range, but it's a great species. We need to look at planting more of, especially in reclaiming old pastures and that sort of thing. Black cherry is another one y'all are probably familiar with. It's a tree that occurs in the eastern, probably half to 2/3 of North America. It occurs on mesic sites for deep soils. It's a pretty common woodland tree species in this area. The leaves are known, I think, to be toxic to cattle, but other than that, it's a great species to have around. It's, again, a species that we're after the bark. Black cherry, there are a few introduced species of cherry in our area, so you want to make sure that you're using Prunus serratina or serratina, depending on your Latin. Grows moderately fast, becomes a large tree, does prefer full sun, although it'll take a little shade when it's young. And again, it's a tree that we're looking for the bark from. The inner bark is what we want, or the young smooth bark that's usually harvested before the trees are old enough for the bark to crack and become sort of checked. Most of the demand is currently met through wild harvesting. It's a great overstory candidate for multi-story cropping systems, as I mentioned before, with some other species. So just to sort of wrap this up, I know we're almost out of time. Hopefully we'll have a few questions at the end, but the Herb Hub is available for folks that are interested in growing these and other species. We have multiple resources we can bring to the table. We do trainings for like growing and processing and marketing plant material. We have cost share where we help folks get started. Sometimes we have funding available for planting. We've got the Herb Hub, the actual physical plant, where we have a shared use facility for washing, drying, and milling soon. And we also do marketing, and we hope to get folks premium prices for their premium products. There are a lot of resources out there for folks that are interested in growing forest botanicals, where you can get more resources or more information from. I think I mentioned the plants database is one of them. That's where those range maps came from. Also, there's a really great book, sort of the forest farming Bible, as it were, Growing and Marketing Ginseng, Golden Seal, and Other Woodland Medicinals by Janine Davis and Scott Person. It's available at your local bookstore. If you can't find it there on Amazon, it's available. And of course, we here at ASD are here to help as we can. So, Sandy, I will wrap up. And if we have any questions, I can take those now, or if not, maybe you have some questions.
Well, I got both. One, is there a app that you can download onto your smartphone that you recommend for identifying some of these plants?
There are apps that you can download on your phone. So yes, it's a two-part answer. Yes, there are apps. There are none that I could recommend. So the reason being is, you know, we live in a world where we have both the natural world, the man-made world. The man-made world carries a lot of technology with it, and they don't always interface well. So I've seen folks using apps in the field, and it's pretty much hit or miss. I've seen the apps misidentify things as many times as they identify things. So there's nothing like firsthand experience going to local arboretum or botanical garden and learning, or taking a guided woodland hike by an herbalist to learn how to ID plants in the field. There's really no good substitute for firsthand knowledge. But again, there are apps available. I just can't vouch for their accuracy.
I know I use one on my phone, on iPhone, called Picture This, and I'm sure there's others. Another question, any information on different mushrooms in our area?
There are quite a few mushrooms of commerce in our area. I have to admit, I'm not the mushroom expert at ASD. I have a colleague named Stesha Warren who is. I can speak to the fact that, you know, there are a couple of species that come to mind that are perennially in high demand for local culinary markets and for personal use, things like morel, hen of the woods, which is also known as maitake, or the Cherokee call it wishy, and of course chanterelles, and there are a few others, but I'm probably not the best person to ask on non-vascular plants.
Okay. And I know you at the last slide, or next to the next slide, you've had some resources, but I was just curious, are there any guidelines that ASD has that can be shared that suggest when you should be harvesting some of these plants, you know, and then how you store it the best way? And then if I decide, hey, I'm gonna see if I can make money off of this, how to go about that?
Mm-hmm. It's very species specific, so we could probably spend a day or two talking about, you know, those guidelines based on what species folks had in mind. But that book that I mentioned, let me back up a second. This second highlighted item is Growing and Marketing Ginseng, Golden Seal, and Other Woodland Medicinals, is a really good first stop for folks that are interested in getting into either growing and or, you know, harvesting or managing forest botanicals on their properties. It talks about not only cultivation, but also a lot of post-harvest handling, processing, and that sort of thing. But, you know, basically with most post-harvest handling, what you're trying to do is, if you're not going to use the herb fresh and you need to store it and dry it, you need to get it into shelf stable, to a shelf stable state, like a dry state, as quickly as possible, so you don't get degradation of plant material. You want to clean the material very well. You know, a lot of folks make a mistake of not cleaning their botanicals well, mostly, especially in regard to roots. I always use the example of here. You know, I take a root. Would you eat this? Would you put it in your mouth? Well, if you wouldn't put it in your mouth and eat it, what makes you think anyone else would want to ingest it? You want to make sure that you get all the soil and detritus and foreign material off of there. If it's a big fleshy root, you need to cut it up, get it in your drying facility as quickly as you can, get it dried as quickly as you can. You don't need to use a lot of heat. There's a couple of different methods we use to dry, but it's, you know, there's a lot of moving parts to answering that question.
And is there on these resources where you can find out the value of the plant, or is there a website that see what's, for example, ginseng, what's the value on the market right now? Is there a website that you can go to?
There's really not a one-stop shop. You know, fortunately, you know, these are not commodities, so there's no Chicago Board of Trade setting prices on these. So I always encourage, you know, I mean, traditionally with wild harvested botanicals, the ginseng dealers and root and herb dealers would set the price. But you know, being a horticulturist and a producer myself, or at least coming from that background, I always encourage folks to look at their production cost and what they need from their material first, and then set their price. I think, you know, farmers need to get more in the habit of asking their price based on their production cost and desired profit, rather than letting the market tell them what they're going to get. That said, every spring when the Herb Hub publishes our demand on our website, we do sometimes have some suggested prices on there, but everything is negotiable. And it varies wildly depending on what market you're selling to. You know, if you're selling at wholesale level versus if you're selling at the retail level online, it's, you know, I mean, like for instance, black cohosh is something that typically sold to herb dealers for $2.50 or $3 a dried pound. When I had my company, Moon Branch Botanicals in Western North Carolina, I was selling it for $35 a pound. So that's 10 times different from what traditional herb dealers would pay. But I was selling directly to medicine makers. I wasn't retailing. If I were retailing it, I might have had it at $60 a pound on a website. But, you know, I didn't have the time or expertise to do the website development and maintenance. So that's the honest answer to that question. Is it depends.
And Robin, you all do meetings all around Southwest Virginia. I know you go to the Virginia Highlands Small Business Incubator in Abington. Are those open to the public, or do you have to be a member to participate?
They're totally open to the public. I'll recommend folks check our website, specifically the agroforestry section of our website. Maybe subscribe to our Facebook page. I'm not a Facebook person, but I understand we have a lot of good content on there. A lot of folks use Facebook to keep up with things. We're planning a relatively large gathering next spring in Roanoke at, I think it's the Roanoke Hotel and Convention Center. I can't remember the name of the property. I think that's it. It's owned by Virginia Tech, I believe. A large gathering of folks that are involved in forest farming. And also one big resource that is not on this list, and I can't recommend it enough, is the Appalachian Beginning Forest Farmers Coalition website. And if you just, I think it's abffc.org, I believe. But if you'll search for the Appalachian Beginning Forest Farmers Coalition, you will find the website. Probably even if you search for ABFFC, you'll find the website. That's a wealth of information. Most of our and our partners' programming is typically listed on there: upcoming events, workshops, training, that sort of thing. So I don't know why I don't have it on this resource slide, but I should. This is a great resource for folks.
Great. Well, Robin, I want to thank you. We're running out of time, but we couldn't do this without folks like yourself sharing your talents and expertise with that. And Tammy, I saw your message pop up in chat. What I will do is send Robin's slides, as well as soon as I can edit and get the video uploaded, I will attach the link to that in a post email later today or early in the morning. But thank you for doing this. I do want to put a plug in for our next new knowledge session, which will be held on June the 21st. It will be kind of a follow-up to our February the 15th session on Canva. If you don't use Canva, Canva, it's a great online desktop publishing and does video development and brochures and so forth. But we're actually doing an advanced session on June the 21st on Canva 201, and Tachi Panay with the Capital Region Small Business Development Center will be back doing that. And I just appreciate, Robin, you sharing information today on this. I wanted to also give folks a heads up on a new series that we're starting in July on our new knowledge program, and that will be all focused on Google, the various products and services that you can use in Google. And we're going to be having 10 sessions starting in July through December. And if you don't, I will include information on that on the follow-up email, but I hope you can join us, and I'm sure you'll be added to if this is your first time today, you'll be added onto our email list to get notifications on upcoming sessions. Again, I can't stress enough, there is a large archive of these new knowledge sessions that are available on our Facebook page, New Knowledge. There's we're probably getting close to 250 videos that we've uploaded over the past 10 years. And they're also available on the Virginia Highlands Small Business Incubators Facebook page, and that's where we'll be loaded up again. But again, thanks so much for coming today. And Robin, I appreciate your support of our new knowledge program. Hope everybody enjoys the rest of your day, and hope to see you again soon at another session. Have a good one. Bye-bye.